Welcome to Spotlight on the Arts. I'm Patrick Christiano, your host, the publisher of TheaterLife.com, a website for theater buffs covering all things theater. And I have a really special guest today, my friend, Regina Weinreich. Regina, it's great to have you here today. It's so exciting to Regina and I were at the theater, I don't know, a few weeks ago, and I discovered things about you I never knew before. So thank you for coming.
Even though we've known each other for a really long time.
How long is it?
Some decades, I would say.
Jesus.
Just being out and about at theater, being out here on Long Island. So, it's a thrill for me to be joining you today.
Well, we've been talking about doing this for a long time, and
It's true.
Regina happens to be an expert on Jack Kerouac. Now, I am pretty much a novice considering my age. I should know a lot about Jack. I mean, I do know he wrote On the Road, and he's referred to as the beatnik, created the beatnik generation, even though he doesn't think of himself as one. But I've never read On the Road, and you wanted to come and talk about it because you're doing lectures or something right at the moment.
Yeah,
Yes,
it's a kind of boom year for Jack Kerouac
because it is his 100th birthday.
yeah, it's his centennial, and there have been readings at bookstores all over the country. There have been celebrations all over the country in his hometown of Lowell, Massachusetts. City Lights had a panel that I participated in. There was a recent symposium that I was part of at the Bob Dylan Center in Tulsa, in Oklahoma. They wanted to.
When was this?
This was just last month, the beginning of June, and
I
they
think that was right after we met. So I think that was what kind of was the catalyst of us starting to talk about this, about you
that
doing
could
this.
be. I was probably just preparing my notes
And when
and
you go,
getting ready.
what do you do? What did they do with these?
Well, the idea was to talk about Jack Kerouac and his relationship
let's just
to
pull up
Bob
the
Dylan.
let's just pull up the book first and then go back. I'm
Okay,
sorry.
sure.
But let's just, so for our readers, who anybody that's not familiar with On the Road, can we have that, John, the cover of his book On the Road? So this is Jack's On the Road, and it's one of the most influential books.
Of the 20th century,
And it was published in 19. Thank you, John. In 1957,
correct?
but he wrote it.
In,
It was a series of notes. Is that how it?
well, he wrote it in 1951, and he wrote various versions of it. And the one that was published in 1957 was a version of it that had been heavily edited at Viking. At prior to that, he had written what was considered the most important manuscript on a scroll of paper. Actually, not a scroll. I mean, this has been revised.
But what made it so important?
Well, I mean, how many books do you know? How many novels do you know that are actually written on pieces of paper that are glued together and create a scroll so that it's one big long continuum?
Right.
And basically, he thought of the novel as one sentence that unfurled across the entire New York Public Library when it was on display in 2007. So, for the 50th anniversary. So it was a very, very unusual work.
So
And in
but
fact,
but the story is about people on the road. Is that correct?
okay, that it's about his adventures on the road with a friend of his, and the original scroll version had the actual names of the friends that were involved, including the catalyst for it all, Neil Cassidy. When they edited it for the 1957 version, and that's this version that we all know and have read, uh, the names were changed because the publishers were worried about lawsuits. But it's a work of fiction.
So
It's
what is it about the book that struck such a chord to create such a wave in the period when it came out?
Well, I'll tell you that when I became interested in this book
Mm-hmm.
and interested in Jack Kerouac as a doctoral subject, I
Mm-hmm.
mentioned that to a friend of mine and her father. And her father said, "You know what? That book gave me permission to get divorced." And you're like, "What?" 1950s America was very conservative and very cookie cutter, the rules were very narrow for people and their lifestyles. And uh, the very, very first sentence of this published version, if you will allow me to read that,
Sure.
was, "I first met Dean not long after my wife and I split up." Today, this is not a very shocking
No,
sentence.
people do it all the time.
In 1957, that was a shocking sentence.
Mm-hmm.
People just didn't split up.
This book is. Did he think that he felt that there was a youth movement, that was the underground, that was counter to.
Well, yes, that he was noticing that life that he was living, leaving home, going on in cars, driving fast, meeting a guy who not only talked fast, this Neil Cassidy person, but he was also a person who drove very fast. And they basically were a buddy movie in the making, uh, traveling cross country. And that was something that was really rebellious. I mean, people aspired to, suburban lifestyle, a wife, kids, a refrigerator, whatever the trappings of middle class life were, that's what you were supposed to want. And that's what you were supposed to be. And if people
So
wanted
it's
to
the
do
first time in
something
our
else,
cultural
it was
history that people began to think beyond doing things like that, and it was
right. And what aided and abetted that was the creation of the great highway system in America.
uh-huh.
Suddenly, you really could take a car and drive fast and go somewhere.
But even though he spurned what people were called the beatniks, they were called beatniks. Is that right?
Well,
People
that came later, and actually,
because he
all the
doesn't think of
writers
himself
involved.
he doesn't think of himself as a beatnik at all.
No, the idea of the beatnik was a pejorative term later on to go along with the idea of the Sputnik.
Oh
And it
yes,
was
that was a
coined,
way to put them down.
right. Right. It was coined by a journalist on the West Coast, in
Right.
fact. But the beat idea was something that Allen Ginsberg, who had spent some time in marketing, recognized that a literary group could also be a brand.
Oh,
And
already back
no,
then.
he was very smart about this,
Uh-huh.
and so this label of the Beat Generation really did serve a purpose. And one of the purposes that it served was that everybody who was labeled as beat denied being beat.
And what did it mean if you were beat?
Well, it meant that you didn't belong to that cookie cutter
They
lifestyle.
they wanted the washing machine and the refrigerator
Right,
and the
and the
ironing
house in the
machine
suburbs, and
and a
all the
little
things
picket fence.
you were supposed to want,
Right.
right? But wanted to be free, wanted to exercise the democracy that we all live in, and wanted to move around, wanted to experience life in a different way, and wanted to even talk differently and write differently. So it was a liberating idea.
Which leads us to now you did all of these books. The, the what do you want to talk about next? Because
Well, okay,
I'm watching our time. I mean, you wouldn't believe it goes fast.
it does go. Well, I could say this.
But so you wrote your dissertation, your doctoral dissertation, which was this book, the
Right, it
spontaneous.
became this book. This is
I think we have an image of it too. Can we have
Right.
that, John? The spontaneous. That's the second image, and the photograph on this was
yeah. Well,
important.
I love this image of Jack Kerouac because he's kind of hanging out on a fire escape as it is. And this was a photo by Allen Ginsberg, his friend. Allen Ginsberg, who was the great, great poet, was also a very fine photographer and created a lot of the images that we know and love of the Beat Generation writers. So, in any case, when I decided that I wanted to do
But
a
so that,
dissertation
your
on
dissertation, I'm
Kerouac,
sorry,
yeah, I wanted to come back to that.
Right.
I was probably not one of the first people to recognize what a great artist Jack Kerouac was, but I was one of the first people to be given permission to write a proper academic book about Kerouac in for a doctoral subject.
Right.
And the reason that happened was because they finally said to me, okay, you can write this book as long as you can prove that he is an author worthy of this kind of scholarly attention.
How did you do that? What did you do?
Well, I recognized that he had all these, this relationship to the best literature. That he was a reader. That he wasn't just a guy who hung out and drove around in fast cars. He really
That was
had
his image, right?
that was an image that he created unwillingly in the creation of the characters on the road. In fact, everybody at the time mistook him for the character called Dean Moriarty, which was really more of like his friend, and he was Sal Paradise, and the Sal was for the word salvation. So that should give you a recognition of what they were looking for in this book, which was not only to be free, but also to discover a spiritual component to life. They were seekers. They were on a quest. And I think that's why this book is so resonant for people all the time.
And it's still resonant today because, I mean, that's.
I also recognize the relationship of the writing, and it was a very unusual writing that the Academy thought was ungrammatical. And I recognize that it had a relationship to jazz, which was also one of those cultural forces that were not.
Are you the first person to
particularly
point this out? That no one's ever paid attention to that before?
No, I think people understood that, but I analyzed it.
The spontaneous poetics of Jack Kerouac.
Kerouac.
Yes.
So his idea about spontaneity comes from jazz, and later on he
Because
said
jazz riffs and goes in different directions. And
exactly, and he actually spoke about thinking of himself as a jazz player, as a horn player, blowing one long note, and that should explain the whole On the Road manuscript that just goes on and on and on and on. And he wanted it published that way, by the way, as in the scroll version. But later on, he had to edit it to create a regular novel-sized book in 1957. So.
And he died at an early age of 47.
Yes.
Too.
Yeah.
And after his death, you worked on the estate came to you to do projects.
Yes. Well, what happened? I just want to say that there were a lot of writings that he did between the non-publication of On the Road in 1951-52 till 1957. He wrote several books in that period. And at the time of his death, at the age of 47 in 1969, a lot of those manuscripts, particularly, say, the Book of Haikus, for example, which I ended up compiling and editing, they remained in manuscript form, and the estate asked me to put that together. So, and that was a great project because I discovered the whole idea that he was a great poet.
But tell us too, what's the book haiku? I'm so dense about haiku. What does it mean?
Well, okay, you were taught that a haiku was a 17 syllable, 3-line poem, probably in elementary school, maybe in junior high. But Kerouac looked at that. He had been influenced by the translations of the Japanese form of haiku by a scholar named R.H. Blythe, and he then created something he called the American haiku, which is very different from the Japanese haiku, but still contains the elements of the Japanese haiku: a relationship to nature, a relationship to seasons, and the idea of a very, very short poem that can go very, very deep and say a lot in very, very few words.
Is there anything about numbers in it too?
No,
No?
no, not
So
at
it
all.
just has to have a relation to nature,
Yeah,
predominantly.
predominantly. And then there's a kind of sister to haiku, which are called senryu, and those are related to human nature. And he wrote a lot of those too. And there's a whole school of American haiku poets that consider themselves disciples of Kerouac and his way of doing haiku.
Wow. Now, you wrote the introduction to the,
Yes.
and give us some insights into what you saw.
Well, I began to see that he really took haiku seriously in a way that people didn't give him credit for in his writing at all, that he took writing seriously. The
Why do you think they didn't? Why you didn't take writing seriously?
Because they considered On the Road, for example, completely ungrammatical, and the phrasing was kind of wild, and the sentences didn't stop the way sentences stop. They just went on and on. But
So all the grammar, the punctuation, all that is non-existent.
well, it was existent, but not in the ways that people usually use punctuation in American English. So, and then when it was edited, they supplied that kind of sentence structure in the editing process. But with the haiku, Kerouac really tried to be very precise in adhering to the rules of haiku, even though he was breaking them often enough. Does this make sense? I mean, he was a really innovative artist, and he crafted them in a fantastic way. I've discovered that many of the themes of On the Road and many of the other books that he wrote were also themes that he included in haiku.
Now there's the other book you did the forward on, because this one I find really fascinating, the title of it and his concept behind it. You're a genius all the time.
Yeah. He was asked by his friends William Burroughs and Allen Ginsberg to explain to young writers how did he craft his writing. So he wrote 2 essays, and they're kind of odd essays. One of the concepts was you're a genius all the time. So in other words, he's extolling writers to be confident in their words.
Well, I mean, and also to just be who you are,
And
and
yeah,
to be yourself, and the freedom to know you're perfect like you are.
that's right. That's right. But a lot of the lines of try never get drunk outside your own house. Be in love with your life. Something that you feel will find its own form. I mean, these are radical ideas for
I mean,
writing.
they were radical ideas then, but when I asked you, on the telephone this morning if you thought he was still relevant. I mean, and you're reading these things to me in the moment now. This is everything that everybody's embracing now. It's like it's all part of the new spirituality that people have stepped into with the affirmations and.
Well, I think this is why people are still interested in Jack Kerouac and will continue to be interested in him forever. You know, that cannot be said for every
But I mean, I think a
literary
lot
figure.
of people probably don't make the connection because I mean, like I never made that connection because I'm not familiar with his work. So if I hadn't been familiar with his work, I couldn't see the connection until like sitting here with you, I get to see it. Like, I'm
Well,
privileged,
you know,
I
yeah,
guess.
you're kind of you know, interested in a source, in the source,
Right,
whereas people kind of accept these ideas now,
right.
and
You know,
without any attribution. But that's okay. You know, I mean, it's not that Kerouac is the only person who advocated these ideas.
yes, of
It's
course.
that he articulated them the way he did, and people can benefit from them. If you look at this, write what you want, bottomless from bottom of the mind. And the idea of being that conscious of the mind is very deep.
And but it's also a very new wave in terms of mindful, being mindful. It's the same thing. I mean,
Right.
they're almost similar, aren't they?
Well, you know,
Yes or no?
I'd say yes, totally. But, you know, but again, I just read somewhere that Katy Perry wa, uh, was influenced by a particular passage of On the Road in writing one of her songs called Fireworks. And it's a passage that has to do with Kerouac's uh, interest in people who were different. I shambled after, as I've been doing all my life, after people who interest me, because the only people for me are the mad ones. The ones who are mad to live, mad to talk, mad to be saved, desirous of everything at the same time. The ones who never yawn or say a commonplace thing but burn, burn, burn like fabulous yellow Roman candles exploding like spiders across the stars, and in the middle you see the blue center light pop and everybody goes, ah.
And Kathy Perry,
Katy
Katy
Perry.
Perry
Yeah,
is the pop singer.
correct. So, I mean, the influence continues. You know, people are, you know, pick up this work and uh, use it all the time.
And we digressed so far from the beginning of when you were at the Bob Dylan. We never got to tie that point together what they were doing there. Do you remember?
Well, there was the celebration of not only the centennial of Jack Kerouac, but the opening of the Bob Dylan Institute
Oh wow,
in
what is that?
Tulsa. Well, it's a museum there.
For all of his works and how his stuff came to be and stuff like that.
Well, it has it's a museum next to the Woody Guthrie
Oh
Museum.
wow. How
I
cool.
yeah, of all of his archival material. So there are all kinds of photographs, and you can listen to music, and you can see the jacket that he wore in a particular at a particular concert that was relevant, and so on. So it was kind of fun to be there because I had been at a Bob Dylan concert as a teenager that turned out to be historic.
Hmm.
It was one in Forest Hills when he switched from an electric guitar to an electric guitar from an acoustic guitar in the second act, and literally people stormed the stage. Yeah. So, you know, it's
Brings
funny
back
for me
memories,
to
right?
think about that event in from 1965 to the fact that Bob Dylan was very, very much influenced by Jack Kerouac in his songwriting and in his book Chronicles, and uh, also rejected him, or rejected the character of Neil Cassidy, for example. And, but that's the power of influence, I think, that you can be so on fire about something and then kind of, move on to the next. And I think Dylan was very capable of moving on.
Oh, yeah, constantly,
Yeah.
constantly. He's a reinventor. Yes, he
Yeah.
is.
So,
One last thing. We're running out of time. We only have a couple minutes, less than
yes.
2 minutes left. We talked about his death, and you thought that was interesting because people attribute it to alcoholism, but you said there was something complicated about it.
Well, there was something complicated about it because he at the time he was in St. Petersburg, Florida. He
And
was
he was only 47.
He was only 47. A lot of his books had not been published, and he, was just kind of, down and out really, and would go to bars and incite people to beat him up. And he actually, so yes, you can say this is related to his alcoholism, but he was also, he just, he had been beaten up a week before his death, and actually died of internal hemorrhaging.
Oh, sounds tragic.
Yeah, it was a really tragic thing. To me, that's a suicide. So
That's alcoholism to me. I mean, it's the alcohol brain that took him there, and it's a wet brain in a way.
well,
But
whatever.
we have 30 seconds.
Whatever. He was this really important cultural figure who, unfortunately, couldn't handle fame
A
when
lot
he
of
had
people
it.
can't handle fame. And look, I mean, and today people are really out there about how they can't handle it.
Yeah.
Regina, thank you so much for coming. It's a
Thank
pleasure
you
to
for
have you.
having
We've
me.
been talking about this ever since I started doing the show, so I'm glad we finally made it. And Truman wasn't too bad. We hardly knew he
And
was here.
I didn't get to tell my Truman story,
Oh.
who considered Kerouac's writing, that is, Truman Capote considered it just typing.
On that note, we'll see you next time. Have a great day.